Thank you all very much indeed, and it's a pleasure to be here. And I would like in particular to thank Joanne, who earlier this morning introduced the audience to the concept of Canada. And I want to build on perhaps some of what Joanne said. Understandably, Irish migration studies focus very much and very often on the United States, more romantic. The concept of manifest destiny, the attainment of the American dream, has a lot more pizzazz than perhaps Canada, which tends to be rather restrained in its public imaging, I think. I'm not sure what's happening here, but anyway, it looks like you have had the talk already. However, from Joanne's introduction, I would like to look at a general overview from a historical geographical point of view of the Ulster contribution to Canada, and in particular its contribution to the city of Toronto. And Toronto, the Belfast of Canada, is a book which I've just published by University of Toronto Press, and it's part of what I want to say is distilled out of that in any event. It was on a fine June evening, somewhat better weather I think than we're having today, in late June 1950, that shipyard workers pulled the carriage bedecked in blue and white flags through the streets of Belfast, down Royal Avenue, across Donegal Square to the City Hall. The carriage was preceded by several hundred Irishmen dressed in their lodge regalia, marching 8 abreast, and a crowd of approximately 50,000 people were gathered in Donegal Square, or as it was referred to colloquially then, Blitz Square. The person or persons in the carriage were Sir Basil Brooke and his wife, and they were being brought to the City Hall in Belfast to be awarded the honour of the freedom of the city. Freedom of the city was being awarded to them in recognition of the perceived success of Basil Brooke's recent 8-week-long trip to the United States and Canada, a trip advertised as a trade mission, but also a trip that was very much, I think, a propaganda mission. In his speech to the assembled crowd in Donegal Square that night, Brooke singled out in particular, of all the places he had been to on his 8-week-long journey, he singled out Toronto. And he said he had spoken there to some 3,000 Ulster men and women, people who had not seen Ulster for 30 or 40 years, and he had seen the tears rolling down their cheeks. I find myself here tonight, he recounted, with that same choky feeling in my throat as when I spoke to those people. The feeling that I am back among my own people. A week before, in a separate but related communication to Loftus Reid, the organiser of the Toronto visit and the current Grand Secretary of the Grand Orange Lodge of British North America, Brooke had reaffirmed that of her entire tour in the United States and Canada, I feel that Toronto has been the place which most warmed our heart. The meeting in Cook's Church, as I told you at the time, was one of the most touching experiences I've ever been fortunate enough to have. Cook's Church, of course, named after Sir Henry Cook, who adorns College Square in Belfast. In the previous month, one of the local newspapers in Toronto, the Toronto Telegram, had described the spirit of that meeting in Cook's Presbyterian Church in the following evocative terms. Into the royal orange heart of Toronto's Ulsterdom last night strode the spirit of the 6 counties, personified in suave, sober-suited Sir Basil Brooke, Prime Minister of Northern Ireland. The 2,500 who packed Cook's Presbyterian Church, for 99 years a temple of fighting Irish Protestantism, expected Sir Basil, as a member of the Fighting Brookes of County Fermanagh, to take a few good clips at the Southerners, and sure, and he did. There was no doubting the warmth that was accorded to Brooke on his trip. His public meeting in Cook's Presbyterian Church was followed by an official ceremony in the City Hall of Toronto, where the mayor and most of the aldermen were Orangemen. He then paraded through the city to the Ontario Provincial Legislature building in Queen's Park, where the Prime Minister of Ontario was also an Orangeman, and the banquet hall was decorated in flowers that recalled the colours of 3 of the orange degrees: the orange, the purple, and the scarlet, which is particular to Canada. Brooke, in 1950, and those who commentated on his visit, would not have been and could not have been aware of the existential reality that 1950 was the conclusion of a period of Orange dominance in the city of Toronto. Thereafter, the role of the order diminished significantly and rapidly, and it did so in the rest of Canada as well. But I would like now to look briefly at what had constructed that culture of Toronto, where had it come from, and in what ways was it manifested. Well, migration to Canada, or British North America, which incidentally is the largest chunk of the North American province. Canada is a bigger country than the United States geographically, although most of it is under ice for a lot of years. It has to be admitted. Following the collapse of New France in 1759-60, British Empire had effectively got control of what is now the province of Quebec and Ontario. It had earlier got control of New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, Prince Edward Island. And in the years just before the American Revolution, the migrations that had been coming across the Atlantic began slowly, but very slowly and imperceptibly, nudging northwards into British North America, extended northwards. However, the advent of the Napoleonic Wars disrupted transatlantic shipping, and it was not until after 1815 that significant emigration from this part of the world to British North America recommenced. It recommenced along lines that had been established in the 18th century. The Ulster connection with the transatlantic movement reasserted itself early on in the 19th century, and for the first 15 or 20 years it was Ulster ports that were directing most of the settlers across the Atlantic. However, a new imperative was driving that transatlantic migration. It was the imperative of the timber trade, which was now linking Canada with Britain and Britain's industrialising cities, replacing the older Baltic trade. And the returning westward bound ships had plenty of room in their converted steerage for cheap passages to North America. As we see here, this deals with the period just before that which commenced with Joanne's talk earlier this morning. If we look at it here, we find that the shaded area is migration to Canada. And you'll find that between 1815 and 1845, almost 1 million people crossed the Atlantic, and a slight majority of them went to Canada, not to the United States. However, going to Canada did not mean staying in Canada. The main ports of entry were St. John, New Brunswick and Quebec City. The main ports of exit were Derry and Cork, linked with New Brunswick, Quebec linked with Belfast and Dublin, but there were 20 or more other Irish ports that were plying the Atlantic in smaller numbers. But when they landed in Canada, Quebec City offered a ready conduit into Ontario and into the American Midwest, and New Brunswick offered a ready conduit into the American New England states. By the 1840s, it has been estimated that about half of those arriving in Quebec City were heading almost immediately south, and of those arriving in New Brunswick in the 1840s, upwards of perhaps 90% were heading immediately south. But nonetheless, in terms of transatlantic migrations, the Canadian impact was significant, and it was obvious that it was also a pre-famine migration. Thereafter, after the famine, particularly after 1847, when 100,000 landed in Quebec and processed through Brazil, thereafter the numbers entering Canada dwindled down, and it wasn't until the late 1880s, with the settlement of the prairies commencing, and later on in the early 1900s, with the growth of Toronto as an industrial city, that numbers began to pick up. But they never picked up to the same extent as had been the case before. In summary, if you look at what the characteristics of the Canadian Irish were, historically they were mainly pre-famine in origin, they were primarily rural in their settlement choices. The post-famine migrations were small in number and were likely to settle either in the cities or in the prairies. And probably half of the settlers came from Ulster and the immediately adjoining counties of North Leinster. And strikingly again, different to the 19th century migrations to the United States, at least 60% of those who were migrating to Canada and staying in it were Protestant. To try and map the impact of that Protestant and Ulster settlement in Canada, you can adopt a number of approaches. You can do the biographical approach, and you can look at people like Timothy Eaton, who set up the transcontinental chain stores coming from Port Glenone, or William McMaster coming from Strabane, giving his name to McMaster University in Hamilton. You can, as Gillian said earlier, look at place names, and in southwest Ontario you can go to Belfast via Newry, Dungannon and Tralee in a matter of about 15 miles. But for the most part, the counties and the township names in Canada were named by bureaucrats and administrators and surveyors before the settlers arrived. So the distribution of Irish place names is not a good indicator of the distribution of the Irish. You can look at more localised landscape naming. And this is where my friend Wilson Benson, who's part of the book which was launched there earlier, comes into play. Wilson had ended up in southern Ontario, an area which, at the time of Canadian Confederation in 1867, had somewhat over 500,000 Irish people, settlers of Irish origin. Wilson was one of them. He settled up in the town of Markdale, and Markdale was named after Mark Armstrong, who had come from Fermanagh. Markdale had 2 orange lodges and 1 orange hall. Cook's Presbyterian Church again reappeared in a new location. And Wilson Benson's store was named the Belfast House. Further south, you ran through the Orange Valley, another orange hall just outside it, Irish Lake over to the side, and here the River Boyne flowing through. Dundalk is actually located on the River Boyne, for those of you who geography is not properly skewed. But there's another way of trying to look at the impact of Ulster settlers in Canada, and that's to look at icons of Ulster culture. And I think a fair icon of Ulster culture is in fact the Orange Order. Not just solely in terms of sectarianism or political attitudes, but in terms also of a fraternal community organisation that was ingrained deeply within Ulster society and indeed other parts of this island as well. And to capture some of the flavour of using the Orange Order as an indicator of cultural transfer, here is just a story of one family. It's James Johnson, who joined the Orange Order a century ago at St. Faith in Ireland. He came to Canada in 1840 and settled in southwest Ontario. But as it says here, James Johnson affiliated with LOL number 145. He also had 5 brothers, 6 sons and 30 nephews who also belonged to the Orange Order in Canada. One grandson holds the high honour of past Grand Master of Saskatchewan, and this has been contributed in 1930 as a report reminiscences by his granddaughter, who's a member of the Ladies' Orange Benevolent Association in Winnipeg. So we're not talking about something that's marginal here. We're talking about something that was seen as a way of introducing a sense of community and community organisation into pioneering Canada. And if we look at Ontario, it's about 1,000 kilometres from the Quebec border here down to Detroit in the southwest. There were over 1,000 Orange Lodges located in that area. And in fact, in most parts of the settled parts of southern Ontario in 1870, just after Confederation, there were very few parts of settled Ontario that were more than 10-mile distant from an Orange Lodge. As I said, there was over 500,000 people of Irish descent in that province. 69% of them were Protestant. The largest denomination was Anglican, followed by Methodists, and Presbyterians came in third. But those religious denominations recorded in Canada are not necessarily the religious denominations of the people as they left Ireland. Religion and denominations in religion were often an elective choice when you got to the other side. But that settlement of Canada in the pre-famine period took place at the time of the second generation of expansion of the Orange Order in Ireland. Founded in 1795 by the early 19th century, the order was gaining momentum. It was spreading throughout Ulster and throughout Ireland. Its headquarters in Dublin there were 33 primary lodges located in Dublin at the time, more than there were in Belfast. And as that order spread, it spread particularly in Canada. And so by 1900, here we find that the numbers in Ireland and Canada. Canada has actually got more Orange Lodges in 1900 than has Ireland. And there's, interestingly, a significant chunk in the United States. More Orange Lodges in the United States than there are in Scotland or England. That culture of Orangism, transplanted Ulster culture, is manifested more particularly in Toronto than anywhere else. It's also augmented in Toronto by the fact that it was a locale to which there was an ongoing migration right through the post-famine period and well up into the 1940s, 1950s. I drop down and then pick up again after that. Toronto and Belfast, as the sports commentators would say, it's a game of two halves. Before 1900, Toronto was the biggest city. The population's crossing at just under 400,000 in 1900. Thereafter, Toronto becomes a much bigger city. But we're not talking of an insignificant place here in the 19th century. We're talking of Toronto as a city which was growing rapidly and was quickly approaching 200,000, 300,000, and by 1900 approaching 400,000. It was a city which in 1847, when the famine migrants arrived in it, found that there were 18 aldermen in charge of the city. All of them were Protestant, and half of them were Orange men. By 1860, the first mayor of Toronto, elected on a specific Orange ticket, was elected. Metcalfe, who came, I think, from Dungannon. And thereafter, from 1860 through until 1950, in that 90-year period, virtually every mayor of Toronto was an Orange man. Not only that, but the majority of the aldermen were Orange as well. And in addition, in most years, all of the aldermen were Protestant, despite the fact that Toronto had a population of Catholics that was not dissimilar to the percentage they occupied in contemporary Belfast, around about 20-25%, a little over 25% in some censuses. But unlike Belfast, where you had a number of Catholics represented in City Hall, because the segregated geography of electoral districts in Belfast allowed majorities from areas such as the Falls Road to return co-religionists to the City Hall. In Toronto, you did not have that type of residential segregation. The population was not segregated residentially on religious lines. And every ward, every electoral ward in Toronto, therefore, had a population that reflected the majority population of the city, Protestant, and hence the totality of the alderman representation in the city hall. Within that city, the operation of Orangism as a power bloc is really where my interest lies. There was sectarianism, of course, there were sectarian riots, but the total of people injured and killed in Toronto in sectarian riots throughout the whole of the 19th century wouldn't even equate with a bad weekend in Belfast in the 19th century. So it was a very different scene. The power was much more one of an urban political machine. And there is a direct coincidence between the period when the Orange Order as a political machine ran Toronto and the same period in New York when Tammany Hall ran New York. It's linked in with much bigger issues of municipal governance in new cities. But there is that coincidence. And that municipal governance and municipal culture was manifested in a number of ways. First of all, you organised the elections. You ran a slate, you made sure that you got the right people elected. And so Orange and so Protestant was the city of Toronto that in fact very often the contest for the office of mayor was contested between two fellow Orange men of different political persuasions. Same religious, same fraternal persuasion, but different political ones. They had that luxury. But that culture, that municipal culture, was supported by a culture of patronage and support that pervaded the city. I don't know whether orange coal burns any different than other fuel, but Rogers was certainly going to make his point. And there were many, many other adverts in the Toronto newspapers of the 19th century that led you to, you wouldn't be confused as to where to do your business. And if you were confused, by the 1920s, in fact, a list of all the major employers in Toronto was produced with the percentage ownership of Catholics denominated on it, and 100,000 of these leaflets were distributed around the city so that you would be reasonably sure of where you could conduct your business. And if you wanted an orange undertaker, well, you could get an orange undertaker. But that totality of municipal culture that was Protestant and Orange was an outgrowth of Ulster transplanted values, but its success is not measured in terms of ethnic retention. Its success has to be measured in terms of its ability to become the culture of the majority. And so, who were the Orange men? Well, I have identified population of about 3,000 Orange men for the 1890s, and I've traced them through various assessment records and censuses, etc., to find out who they were. And what you have here in the top line is the percentage in the city of Toronto of the various people of the various places of birth. So, for example, 65% of Torontonians were born in Canada, and 47% of Orange men in Toronto were born in Canada. So if you're a Canadian-born person, you're fairly likely to join the order, but you're less likely than might be expected given your population share of the city. But look at the rest. Ireland, okay, to be expected. The Irish were 9.2%, Irish-born now, were 9.2% of the city of Toronto in 1891, and 24% of Orange men were Irish. But only 24% of Orange men in Toronto were born in Ireland. 75% were not born in Ireland. Look at the English. 15% of Toronto's population was born in England. But 20% of the Orange men in the city were born in England. The English were overrepresented, significantly overrepresented in the lodges. And the Scots are slightly overrepresented. The USA underrepresented as you might perhaps expect. There's an application for admission to the order in 1913, and there are many of these to be seen in Toronto. It's from a person who is a carpenter. He's Church of England, and he was born in England. And he's applying to be a member. Why? And the answer is that patronage in the city was very much in the control of the machine, and the machine was Orange. That machine operated most effectively in City Hall, where at the turn of the century, 95% of the employees were Protestant, 75% of them were Orange, and 5% were Catholic. In fact, the 5% Catholic is the identical figure to the number of Catholics employed in clerical offices in Belfast City Hall. But the city of Toronto had much more of a population than 5% Catholic. But outside of City Hall, that machine politics was even more evident. Firemen, for example, were about more than 80% Orange, and were certainly more than 90% Protestant. Police had a number of Catholics, perhaps 15% Catholics in the lower ranks, but no police officers were Catholic above a certain grade. And so numerous were Orange men in the police force of Toronto that the police had set up their own degree team, which used to go and visit the various lodges in the city and initiate policemen into the different degrees of the Orange Order within those lodges. It's the only profession when there's an example that the degree team travelled around the city rather than being composed from the Grand Lodge or the County Lodge. That element extended into non-municipal employers, the post office, which was federal. The majority, again, were Protestant, and a very high percentage were Orange. The Toronto Transit Commission, the Customs House, the same. And indeed, as late as 1950, Orange men who were members of the City Hall employees or employees of the Toronto Transit Commission would be given the day off with pay to attend the Orange Parade in the city. And not only that, but if they were delegates to provincial Grand Lodges or the National Grand Lodge and had to go to Ottawa or Winnipeg for an annual meeting, they were allowed time off with pay to do so. City Hall pretty well closed down on the 12th of July. And that's the way it remained when Brooke was there, Basil Brooke was there in 1950. It was a period very much where the Orange Order was not peripheral to life in the city. This is the 1930 parade in the city, downtown Toronto. It was a particularly important parade because it marked the centenary of the foundation of the Grand Orange Lodge of British America. There were something in the order of, I think, 15,000 Orange men paraded through the city of Toronto that year. Not all of them were from Toronto, but some visiting lodges from Detroit, some from other parts of rural Ontario. But the vast majority were Torontonians. 26,000 people watched the parade. It took 4 hours to pass a given point. It was led by the mayor. It was led also by the majority of the aldermen in the city, by the head of the architectural services, the head of the financial services, the head of the city clerk's office, the head of the engineering and waterworks services. It included also the Speaker of the Federal House of Parliament in Ottawa, his equivalent number in the provincial legislature in Queen's Park, and it included also G. Howard Ferguson, the Prime Minister of Ontario, who was marching in his 33rd Orange Parade. And with that mixture of parliamentarians, federal and provincial, aldermen and mayors and former mayors, professional classes and the leaders of major employers, there was no doubt that the Toronto Parade had a much stronger political and social composition than any Orange Parade in the world except perhaps Belfast. Liverpool, which had perhaps more Orange lodges but they were much smaller, Glasgow, which had fewer Orange lodges, never really attained that level of machine politics in the governance of Liverpool or Glasgow. Toronto and Belfast are comparable in that respect. And for that reason, the epithet was often thrown around that Toronto is the Belfast of Canada. For some, particularly if you're a minority of Catholics, you saw it as an insult that you threw at your Protestant neighbours, that you're the Belfast of Canada. But if you were part of the machine politics, there was a certain pride in being known as part of the Belfast of Canada. And it was into that Brooke was touching when he met that 2,500 people in Cook's Presbyterian Church. But he met them in 1950, just before the organisation fell off a cliff. Multicultural immigration in the post-war period, various other aspects of changes of life had led to a decline in the Orange Order. And here we have the Dian Lodge, primary lodge building, built in 1914 when the lodge was getting close to its peak, named after Dian No. 1 Lodge in Ireland. But it has, in addition to the front, you can see the minarets, and it's now the fattest mosque. It's the first mosque established in Toronto, established in 1992 when a local imam bought out the Orange Hall. And today, what was an organisation including tens of thousands is now an organisation which, if you draw the old city boundaries of Toronto, there's probably not more than 200 people who are Orangemen within it. If you take the expanded city boundaries, you pick up some of Joanne's immigrants of the last 20 years who have moved out far into the suburbs, and some of whom have established themselves in lodges. But the Orange Order in Toronto today, small in number, is once again, as it was at the beginning of the 19th century, an immigrant organisation. It has ceased to be what it was at the beginning of the 20th century, which was a power machine that appealed and applied to a variety of ethnic and cultural groups whose one thing they all had in common was that they had to be Protestant to join, but after that, ethnicity meant nothing. Access to power and patronage was the attraction, and it was what drove urban municipal politics for 90 years in Toronto, just as different variants of it drove it in Chicago or New York in the same years. Thank you very much.